It was 1953. My brother and I were sitting on the edge of the swimming hole, barely dipping our toes in. You gotta believe me, Doug. If you don't, nobody will. Tim's eyes were watery. I'd never seen him like this before. He was a tough kid. The only other time I could remember him crying was when he nearly broke his leg trying to climb up Dodgers Hill. Tim, that just doesn't make any sense. You know that, right? He was probably just an old hobo. There's loads of them around. He was no hobo, Doug. Cross my heart. His small hands made a crossing gesture over his chest. Tim has just finished telling me about a man he had seen at the swimming hole a couple of days ago. He had been alone that day, but wanted to try some fishing just the same. He said that he stuck his rod into the mud, and then went to get his sandwich from under the tree close to the bank. He gestured to the tree as he said this. It was about 20 feet away, gently swaying in the warm summer breeze. When he turned back around, there was a man standing at the shore. Tim described him to me. He was wearing a suit like one of Daddy's. With a hollow voice, he asked, "Ain't never seen a hobo wearing a suit before, have you?" I hadn't. The man's fingers were long and wrinkled, and his feet appeared bare. Water fell from his arms and his body in small streams, and it didn't stop. The worst part was his eyes. What was wrong with his eyes? He didn't have any. All that remained were sunken pits, horrible and empty, and yet somehow, Tim said, he could feel the man wanting. Wanting what? Tim was silent for a moment, and then said, "I don't know." He seemed wanting in the way that people want that pretty actress lady with the yellow hair. Miss Monroe? Yeah, that's her. He fell silent for a few moments. Finally, I said, "What did you do?" I ran out of there as fast as I could. I don't think he followed me. I don't think he can get out of the water. Both of us took our toes out of the swimming hole. We sat there for a little bit, watching the waves ripple in the wind. To break the silence, I raised my voice at him. "Well, lay off it now, Tim. You nearly scared the bejesus out of me." He said nothing, and I felt embarrassed that I had said anything. Eventually, we got out our fishing rods and sat there together for maybe an hour or so. I remember we caught a few bream, but nothing exciting. I thought that maybe his story had scared away the fish, but now I'm not so sure that was it. I got up to take a leak, and when I came back, Tim was gone. I was rummaging through my old pictures in the storeroom when I first noticed her in them. To be honest, I hadn't noticed her earlier in the pictures. In almost all of the pictures, she was in the background, like a distant blur. But she was there, the exact same old lady. I had been seeing this old lady everywhere since the past few weeks. In my school, at the grocery store, whenever I was alone in a crowd, this old lady would just stand at a distance and look at me. She would keep staring at me until I couldn't look at her anymore. It felt as if she was trying to say something to me. She looked peculiar. Grayish short hair, wrinkled skin. But what struck me most were her eyes. They were completely dark, and it felt very disturbing to look at her. Yet something ordered me to keep gazing at those eyes. It felt as if she was looking inside you with those eyes. I called my mother to ask if she was some relative of ours, and let her know that she had come to our town recently. I thought she would be happy to see the pictures, but she turned completely silent instead, her eyes fixed at the old woman in the picture. On asking numerous times, she said, "This is my mother. Your grandmother. She destroyed my life. I ran away from my home when I was exactly your age. But I was pregnant with you. She suddenly appeared in my life again. She could have destroyed your life too, but..." She stopped with a dreadful pause. "What, Mom? But what?" "She died the day you were born. We went to her funeral, but we weren't allowed inside her house." Then she took the pictures and went out of the room to burn them. As soon as she left, the lights went out. Looking around in the dark, I saw that same old woman sitting on a chair in the corner of my room. "It's time you come with me now." Alice was the most beautiful girl I had ever laid eyes on. She was sweet and kind, with confidence that shone brighter than the stars in the night sky. She had the milkiest white skin. Her hair was jet black with emerald green eyes and natural blood red lips. The day she walked into my life, I know we were meant to be together forever. It took me months to work up the courage to say hi to her. When she said hi back, I was hooked. I did everything to make sure she knew how much I loved her. When she was sick, I would watch over her all night to make sure she was all right. I would spend hours just stroking her hair. She loved it. I made sure she started every week with a smile with a fresh bouquet of flowers sent to her where she worked. She was loved, and she loved me back. But then things began to change. She started becoming withdrawn. She stopped leaving the house, wouldn't go to work. She wasn't going to tell me what was wrong, so I had to find out for myself. It didn't take me long to find out she was getting unwanted calls from a guy claiming to be madly in love with her. He was bombarding her day and night with phone calls, sending her creepy letters saying if he couldn't have her, no one could. It was my job to keep Alice safe, and I promised her I would protect her. So I decided to stalk her stalker, and it didn't take me long to find out where he lived. He lived in a dingy apartment in a place known as Skid Row. I watched his movements. I watched his obsession grow. It was then I knew I needed to act. I broke into his apartment knowing he was busy watching Alice. As I looked around his apartment, his obsession was a lot greater than I expected. He had pictures of her all over the place. That night he came back to his apartment not knowing I was lurking in the shadows. Watching Alice must be tiring work, I thought to myself as he passed out on his bed. I crept out from the shadows. I stood over him as his chest heaved in and out. I picked up a pillow and placed it over his head. By the time he knew what was happening, it was already too late as he struggled for air. And before I knew it, his body went limp. It didn't take long for Alice to get her life back on track. She was back to her bubbly, happy self again. As I watched over her as she slept, I couldn't help think, did she know how lucky she was? I stroked her hair as I leaned in to whisper in her ear. Soon, my love, you will finally notice me and realize how much I love you. My brother and I were always close. He was extremely shy, he never invited over friends, and he always stayed in our room. Growing up, our parents were dirt poor. After 3rd grade, we moved into a basement my parents rented. This meant that Eric, our parents, and I had to share one room. One bed for us, one bed for our parents. I never minded it, but Eric seemed to. It was around here that he started to change. Mom and Dad sold a lot of our stuff to make ends meet. Eric got it the worst. Pretty much everything of his was sold, his bed, his favorite comic books, half his clothes. I offered to share my bed with Eric, but he always refused. He said that he had trouble sleeping at night. I asked him why once, and he told me that he was afraid of dying. He heard stories of people falling asleep and never waking up again. He didn't want that to be him. I tried telling him that he shouldn't be afraid. We would watch over each other. He would always refuse. I'll watch over you, he insisted. I would argue, but I was never able to stay awake long enough for him to fall asleep. I felt bad for him. We weren't in any of the same classes, he never spoke to either of our parents, and wouldn't meet any of my friends. He said he only cared about me. We're brothers, he explained. I just want to hang out with you. It all changed when we graduated. I got accepted into our state school, while Eric didn't even bother applying. It was then that I realized Eric wasn't the same brother I grew up with. Instead of trying to get out of poverty, he was going to rot away at home. I told him he was going to end up like our parents. He didn't respond, only watched as I loaded my truck and drove away. I really regret it. I shouldn't have said that to Eric, and I plan on making it up to him. Now that the semester ended, we can finally get back in touch. I bought all of his favorite things, his favorite movies, his favorite CDs. I even managed to hunt down copies of old comics Mom and Dad sold. As I got home, I noticed something was off. Eric wasn't there. I asked my mother where he was, and she immediately started crying. I asked Dad, and he told me to get out of their home and never come back. I couldn't figure out why until I got a call 3 days later. It was my father. He said he was concerned that my countless voicemails asking about Eric wasn't a joke, and that's when I got the truth. Eric and I went to the park in 3rd grade. Only I came home. All I could do was push one button. One big, red button that had 2 functions. 1, open. 2, close. Open. He's there again. He's not far away now. Close. After falling from a great height at age 11, I'd suffered from major back pain for the most of my life, and after just one bad trip to the spa, meant I was now trapped, almost completely paralyzed in my own car. I could barely stand the strong mix of bad food and gone-off milk, and I could pretty much taste the rotting meat that had been nicely wrapped by the butcher and was now sat next to me on the passenger seat, festering away. The raw stench clung tightly to my nasal hairs and soaked through my pores. With every hot and labored breath I took, I swear I could feel tiny meat fibers being sucked into my lungs. I'm gonna go take the kids to the lake house this weekend, my husband Miles had said. I thought it would give you some much needed alone time that you've been so desperately wanting lately. You can now rest your back, or maybe even get a massage. Oh, I'd love to have the whole house to myself for a weekend. I love you, Miles, I told him. Don't come back too early, I teased. This was Friday evening, and I've been here ever since. It's now Sunday. It's 8:38 p.m., and according to my car's thermostat, still a whopping 84 degrees Fahrenheit. I pressed the one big red button for a millionth time. Open. I had to keep opening the garage door for airflow. I most certainly would have died before now if it hadn't been for this button. Not only was I trapped inside my own car, but that car is then inside a metal garage that's been flash fried by the intense summer heat for 2 weeks solid, with no rain relief. And if it weren't for him, I would have kept the damaged thing open the whole time. His features were blurred and he only wore black. There was something large in his hand, but I was yet to make it out. He only walked toward me with my garage door fully open. Problem is, my family and I lived in a quite posh area that just so happens to be pretty much desolate too. The nearest neighbor lives about 5.2 miles away. He never stops walking until I close the door. I press the button once again. Close. In the beginning, I tried yelling for help and honking my horn, but that was when he was just a tiny blur in my windscreen, and it wasn't long before I realized that he wasn't there to help me. Ugh. So hot. Open. He crept towards me, one long but slow stride at a time. It was simply just a game to him. What would get me first? Dehydration or close? I'd say I have about 4 or 5 more button presses before he eventually reaches me, but it's just too... Open. Last year I found a hole in the public records. Almost 200 people missing, 40 government officials, a 2-story state-owned building is unaccounted for. One entire prison disappeared overnight. There's nothing about it. A black hole of information. Over the last year, I've tried to investigate the matter. Up until last week, I gained nothing. I tried to interview the families of the missing prisoners. They shut their doors at my face and told me to go away. They seemed afraid. I wanted to keep the story my own, so I had to do my own groundwork without connections. My one remaining option was to investigate the missing prison on my own. Travel was difficult. The prison was in the middle of a harsh desert, and the road to it was blocked off. By the time I got to the site, the sun had gone down, but even in the dim evening twilight, I could see what they had done. The site was razed to the ground. A few charred walls and pillars still stood in the back, but the roof had caved entirely. Burnt wood and ash littered the floor, and the old building upper skeleton covered everything else. Stepping around the site, I took pictures. The brief flash lit up the ash floor and graffitied walls. The red eyes of rats peeked out of the rubble. I could see they were hungry. After 1 hour, I found the cellar door. Hidden behind the back walls, the metal doors were rusted and burned. Holes peered into the darkness below. There were no locks on the outside. 2 words were scrawled onto them. Human-king. This is where my story lay buried. This is where it all went wrong. I tried the doors, but they wouldn't open, locked from the inside. Unthinking, I started banging the doors. Hello? No one should have called back. But someone did. Who's there? I heard a crawling sound, like giant rats scurrying across the floor to meet me. The crawling stopped in front of the door. The raspy voice came again much closer.
Go away.
I just wanted to... I stopped when I saw things crawling behind the holes in the door. Across the metal surface, dozens of throbbing red eyes peered out of the holes. They were staring at me.
Leave us alone. All we want is to be alone.
I stepped away from the door.
Don't come back.
I walked back to my car. I drove out of there and haven't been back since. I stopped all investigations into the matter. I don't want to think about it. But recently I've been forced to. The photos came back. There were things I couldn't see in the dark. There were body parts on the ground hidden under the rubble, rat kings painted onto the walls. Something happened to the prisoners. Something horrible. And now they just want to be alone.